Здравствуйте, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of History with a Drywaller. This week we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to diverge away from our coverage centering around the man of Joseph Stalin himself, and we are going to cover the Second World War, which in the Soviet Union and I believe in modern Russia is called the Great Patriotic War. Now, the Second World War was a big deal for everybody involved, arguably the largest and most consequential conflict in all of human history, and arguably the Eastern Front, which is to say the fighting between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, is the most consequential part of the most consequential war, and some of the largest battles in human history took place along this front. And because of that, and because of the huge impact that the Second World War would have on the Soviet Union and later Russia, I would like to take this episode to shunt old Stalin to the side for a bit and just focus on the Soviet experience in the Second World War. By no means are we done with Stalin, and Stalin certainly will pop up in this episode, but this episode will mostly be about the Second World War, not Stalin. With that said, we left off last week right at the beginning of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which, if you're curious, was called Operation Barbarossa. It was named after Frederick Barbarossa, who was a very famous emperor and knight in German history. As I mentioned last week, the Nazis were really into callbacks to old, knightly chivalry in German Empire and all that sort of thing. This attack, as we mentioned last week, caught Stalin totally off guard. He would have what might be a nervous breakdown, and he would retreat to his dacha, which is essentially his private palace in the woods outside Moscow. In the meantime, while the Soviet leadership was scrambling to essentially get it together, the German blitzkrieg tactics were devastatingly effective. The German Air Force was essentially able to destroy almost the entire Red Army Air Force while the Soviets were parked on the ground, as the Soviets, throughout this entire initial attack, had no orders to do anything. No one ordered them to return fire. Some units never did return fire. No one ordered them to scramble planes. No one ordered them to counterattack. The Soviet front lines were completely caught flat-footed. The Germans would take advantage of this in a huge way by encircling and isolating hundreds of thousands and then eventually millions of Soviet troops, leaving them to be cut off, starved, and eventually taken prisoner, and often being used as slave labor for the German armies. By the end of 1941, the Germans had captured more territory in a shorter amount of time than any army in human history. They had captured Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarusia, they'd captured the rest of Poland, Ukraine, the Crimea, and most of Western Russia all the way to the outskirts of Moscow. Hitler, who was, as you can imagine, very pleased with this phenomenal success, would then divide his army into three prongs to attack the northern, central, and southern fronts of Russia simultaneously. While the Germans were reorganizing and re-attacking, the Soviet high command would finally get it together, and they would evacuate almost all their factories, workers, and heavy industry over the Ural Mountains and into central Russia, which is an amazing feat of engineering that, unsurprisingly, was never publicized by the Soviets. But unfortunately for the triumphant Germans, as fall and winter began to set in, things began to slow. Not to get too far into meteorology and geography, but the Soviets and modern Russians have a season that comes around twice a year in spring and in autumn, known as the Rasputitsa, which translates roughly, I believe, to roadlessness. And this is essentially when, in autumn, when the rains come, or in spring when the snow melts, all the Soviet road systems, which, especially at this time, were almost entirely dirt tracks, become these just endlessly deep furrows of impossible mud. The Germans had not planned for this. They had anticipated having relatively easy going until winter set in, and therefore they were totally caught unprepared and ground almost immediately to a halt. By December, the German advance had completely halted before Moscow and Leningrad. Zhukov, Georgy Zhukov, who was the general that we mentioned stomping the Japanese in our last episode, would be put in charge of the defense of the Soviet capital of Moscow, and he would oversee the secret transfer of Soviet soldiers from the east, where they'd been keeping an eye on the Japanese, into the east side of Moscow. These movements were kept secret from the Germans and eventually would number over 1 million men. This meant that when these men counterattacked in January, the Germans were completely taken by surprise. The Germans did not think the Soviets had any reserves left, let alone over 1 million men. Therefore, this counterattack would be very successful and would drive the Germans away from Moscow, though they were unable to dislodge the Germans from their positions besieging Leningrad. In the summer of 1942, the Germans would attack again, this time south into the Caucasus, and this was fairly successful. So the Germans still have, at least in the summer when they have roads, the Germans still are able to build that momentum. They would advance almost all the way to the Caspian Sea, and they would end up besieging Stalingrad in central Russia. Then in the winter of 1942-43, remember this, kids, wintertime is not a good time to be fighting the Russians in Russia. Things went decidedly sideways for the Germans. Zhukov, who had been sent to Stalingrad after the victory in Moscow, did his favorite thing. He amassed a staggering amount of reserves outside of Stalingrad, this time on either side, and then launched a series of massive counterattacks. These counterattacks weren't as consistently successful as the ones around Moscow, but eventually, and it should be noted at great cost to the Soviets, they did surround the German army at Stalingrad. After trying to resist and then eventually trying to break out, the German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered his starving and freezing men to the Soviets. After this staggering victory, Zhukov would advance all along the southern front, pushing the German lines all the way back into Ukraine. And after this point, it's almost always a losing war for the Germans. They would be defeated decisively in the field at Kursk in the summer of 1943 and would consistently retreat for the rest of the war. The Soviets would recapture the Baltics, Belarusia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, and eventually they would invade Germany. They captured the eastern half of Germany, and finally, on May 2nd, 1945, they would capture the German capital, Berlin, ending the Second World War in Europe. Now, these conquests, essentially, by the Soviet Union would create the Soviet Union as it became known to later generations. The map of the Soviet Union as of May 1945 looks very, very similar to the map of the Soviet Union that would persist up until, 1991. This is why Stalin is so important. This is why I've taken so many episodes to cover Stalin, because he essentially oversaw the creation of the Soviet Union, even more so than Lenin or Trotsky or anyone else, at least in my opinion. He oversaw what the Soviet Union would become for arguably the rest of its history. Also, while we're on the topic, I'd like to take a brief aside to definitively say that Hitler definitely died in his bunker in 1945. The Soviets captured his bunker, they recovered his body, and later they would publish records of his remains, and Hitler definitely killed himself in his bunker. There's, as always, a lot of goofy documentaries and goofy rumors that maybe he ran an empire in Argentina or escaped to the moon or this, that, or the other thing, but he's definitely dead. I mean, one would think he's certainly dead by now. But anyway, the Soviets would also, as I mentioned briefly last week, renege on their pact with the Japanese, and they would invade Japanese Mongolia, albeit relatively briefly. The campaign only lasted 3 weeks before the Japanese surrendered and the Pacific War officially ended. But before we move on to my fairly brief summary of the Second World War, I would like to stress the staggering violence and horror of this war. The Soviets would lose 10.6 million people, and their nation was devastated for decades afterward. Not to belittle anyone's suffering or anyone's loss, but I do think it's fair to compare that number of 10.6 million to the roughly 1.3 million people lost by all the Western Allies combined. I think that gives you a scale of the sheer carnage on the Eastern Front faced by the Soviet Union. Also, the Germans lost about 5.5 million people in the East, compared to roughly 830,000 in the West. again, I don't want to imply that the Second World War was somehow easier for other people or that it was easier here and there. But I do hope that this gives a sense of the sheer scale of the violence on the Soviet front of the Second World War. Of course, these numbers are relatively recently coming to light. Stalin would very heavily downplay the death and destruction because, he's a jerk and it made him look bad. And later American media would also downplay the death and destruction on the Eastern Front because, well, the Americans didn't want to give credit to the Soviet communists. And as a brief aside, another odd little tangent, the fighting between the Chinese and the Japanese during the Second World War has had a similar experience since then. It was also very important, arguably much larger, more consequential conflict, but was similarly downplayed for similar reasons. Now, given the nature of this podcast, I wasn't really shooting to cover the Second World War in its entirety, certainly, and certainly not even the Eastern Front, but there are great sources on the Eastern Front available, and while I'm not going to give a comprehensive list, as again, there's a lot out there, but a couple of the best, I think, are a show on YouTube that is called The Soviet Storm, and it is made by Stars, which is a Russian media company that is, I believe, owned and operated at least in part by the Russian government. But despite that, it's a surprisingly balanced and critical look at the Soviet experience and Soviet mistakes during the Second World War. And it's also, I believe, something like 13 hours long. So you do get a lot of information, and it's very well put together, and in short, I would highly recommend it. Also, there is a film that was made in 1985 in Russia called Come and See, which I must admit I have not watched because I am too squeamish, but it is purported to be an incredible exploration and demonstration of just how horrible and savage the fighting on the Eastern Front truly was. So hopefully that gives you guys the opportunity to learn more about this and pursue more information about this than just my little 10-minute, outline that I just gave you. But before we wrap up the Second World War and this episode as a whole, I would like to go over one other thing in a strange tangent here. I would like to briefly cover some numbers from the German concentration camps and from the mass killings and the ghettos and the repression and all that, because I think that this is something that has sort of been forgotten due to, as we mentioned before, Soviet repression and later American media repression and adjustment and this, that, and the other thing. So I would like to remind everyone that the Nazis were embarking on a very, very widespread plan to, as they saw it, perfect the world. And this did not just mean Jews. There were many, many, many victims of the Holocaust that I don't think get acknowledged as often, partially because of, in fact, I would say mostly because of Soviet repression of information, but also partially because of the American media and what Americans post-World War II saw as the good guys and the bad guys. Now, all these numbers that I'm going to share with you are rough estimates and are all rounded. But as far as I can tell, they are fairly accurate to the real statistics at the time. And these are people who were killed by the German government, the Nazi government, outside of combat. These were either people who were rounded up outside of villages and shot, or who were worked to death in slave labor camps, or who were straight up gassed and exterminated in the later concentration camps. So these are people that were exterminated explicitly because the Germans did not want them as part of their new world. These are not people who were killed in any way related to the war itself. Now, one thing that is very rarely reported is that 7 million Soviet citizens were rounded up and killed as part of the German occupation. The Germans looked down on what are now known as Slavic peoples as being lesser humans. Unfortunately, the German disdain for non-Germans was not limited to the Jews. Now, that number, 7 million, also includes 1.3 million Soviet Jews. And of course, that is part of the larger 6 million Jews that the Germans were able to get their hands on during the Second World War. The Germans would also kill somewhere around 3 million captured Soviet prisoners of war, again, not in a military context, just to kill them. They would kill 2 to 3 million Polish people, somewhere around 450,000 Serbs, and, of course, quite famously, the Germans embarked on a massive campaign to exterminate disabilities, leading to the deaths of 270,000 disabled people of various kinds. Also among those targeted by the Nazi leadership were the Romani, any Freemasons, Slovenes, Spanish Republicans, Jehovah's Witnesses. Another group that rarely goes reported is as many as 15,000 identified homosexuals were rounded up and murdered as part of this. And as we mentioned last week, the numbers of communists and socialists are really hard to determine, but it is likely that at least tens, if not hundreds of thousands of German leftists were systematically murdered at this time. Now, I hate to end my usually relatively upbeat podcast on such a note, but I think it's important for us to remember that the Soviets and the Russians had an apocalyptically horrible experience in the Second World War. And many of them to this day see Stalin as the one who led them and saved them from the Nazis, which is part of why, even with all of his crimes, he is still a relatively revered figure in the Soviet Union because of the sheer horror and bloodshed of this period and his perceived role as the main enemy of the Nazis. But with that, I think it's time that we conclude this unusually somber episode of History with a Drywaller. And next week, we will continue with the winding down and the end of the wonderful ride that is Joseph Stalin. I'll see you then.